Legislature's back in order. Senator Nelson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a motion to move Bill number 146-34 to the third reading file and discuss the bill. Hearing no objection, you're recognized. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill number 146-34 is an act to amend subsection 4703 Delta 1 and 2, both of Article 7, Chapter 4, Title 12, Guam Code annotated, relative to increasing the first-time homeowner assistance program eligible transaction contract maximum amount from $250,000 to $300,000. Mr. Speaker, this bill intends to do two things. The first is to address the increasing rates of the loan limits given by HUD, and so we're just making that adjustment through time with the Guam Housing Corporation, and then also we are also addressing the increase in housing rates and housing construction costs and et cetera, especially with the limitation of H-2B visas. I do want to note that on the fiscal note, there was a concern that the 4% in subsection 4705, section B, amount of assistance, the amount of the first-time homeowners assistance is 4% of the eligible transaction. And so in response to meet the requirements and the intent as discussed during the public hearing, I have before my colleagues a amendment to proffer. And this basically addresses that the first-time homeowners assistance loan or what they will be given will not exceed $10,000. So yes, we are changing the rate of what you can take the loan up to, but we will not exceed the $10,000 transaction. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. On the main motion with the proposed amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Snickles? Please, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to offer some perspective with respect to the main motion. And it has to do with how this, it's just one of those situations that are a little difficult to really understand until you've really gone through it. The purpose of this program, this is the first-time homeowner assistance program, and it's basically going to provide a $10,000 grant to be able to assist first-time homeowners with the costs of buying that first house. And the intent of that kind of a program is to basically be able to help people afford homes. One of the things, however, that we need to take into consideration is, first of all, this bill is going to increase the valuation of a home that would be eligible for this grant. And when we do that, we are also, by default, raising the floor of what a lower cost home would be. For example, those who are eligible for this grant, depending of course on their borrowing capacity, if they were to max out the $300,000 that they're capable of, they would then provide, this grant would then create more buyers for $300,000 homes, creating a floor in that price. And that floor would technically be artificial because it's being subsidized by the government. And it's important for us to understand the contrast of what kind of a floor we're setting. So for example, in the bill, under the First-Time Homeowner Assistance Program, subsection 1, increasing the contract for the purchase of a home from $250,000 to $300,000. What does that mean? If you're building the house, a $250,000 home with a 90% loan to value would get you a 1,730 square foot home at $130 a square foot, which is more or less what the prices are these days. Hopefully we can bring that lower or closer to that amount. If we raise that to 300,000 at 90%, you're looking at a 2,000 square foot home. At 80%, a $250,000 price tag at $130 a square foot will get you a home that's 1,538 square feet. At 300,000, same cost per square foot, at 80% loan to value will get you a home that's 1,846 square feet. The question becomes, if you look at the market today, how disparate is the amount of homes available that are $250,000 and below or $300,000 and below? And is there a need for us to increase the valuation that's going to be covered by this grant? Because if we do, we're basically going to be raising the floor on what homes would have costed if they did not have this grant. Right now, if you pull up any number of our real estate websites on Guam that are very, very well built, you can access search functions that allow you to search for a single family dwelling at a certain price point or below. If you search for houses that are at a valuation of $250,000, you'll pull up 49 offerings as of right now. I just did it 10 minutes ago. There's 49 homes on the market for $250,000 or below. If you raise that to $300,000, that brings 90 homes into the market. You have 90 houses available at $300,000 and below, an increase of 41 homes. I'm sorry, 41 homes. Now what happens is, if we have more purchases at that $300,000 price tag, it's going to raise valuations and prices are going to continue to creep higher. So one of the challenges that we always need to be mindful of is that if we're going to be increasing our grants based on the HUD limits, if those HUD limits continue to rise and we just keep increasing our grants with respect to that, we may be artificially causing the price of homes on the $250,000, $150,000 level to actually rise as well, because we're going to be encouraging more transactions at that price point. Now what that does is, if you're able to get a grant, lucky you. If you're not, you're just getting priced out of the market in a more difficult fashion, because now you have government subsidies creeping into the equation of valuation. So while this first-time homeowner assistance program is a good program, we need to be mindful of the fact that those who are ineligible for it will be adversely affected by more subsidies at higher price points. So I think for me, I would like for us to step back and ask ourselves the question, at what point do the number of houses on the market at a certain price point justify us increasing the grant so that more homes could be made available at a particular price point? And I think what we need to take a close look at is how many individuals are trying to get a home versus the amount of homes that are available. And if we have more than 49 people, or if we have 30 people or 20 people trying to get a home, and we only have 49 on the market, at what point are we going to say that there is a formulaic basis for us to increase the threshold? Because perhaps it would be necessary if there was a lack of available housing. But when I pull up a search and there's 49 homes at $250,000 or below, and that's existing homes. If you were to build a house and you already had the land, for $250,000 at a 90% loan to value, which is usually what you can get for a rural development, perhaps, you can build yourself a 1,730 square foot home now under the current thresholds and at the current $130 per square foot. So we have 49 existing homes in the market. And if you have your own land, based on Section 2 of this bill, if we did not make this amendment, you can still build a 1,730 square foot home. And so I raise these points, Mr. Speaker, because I really need for us to be mindful of the fact that as we increase these thresholds, if we have more transactions closing at the $300,000 level, appraised values go up, home prices go up, and those who are unable to avail of these grants are going to be the ones having to scrounge together more money to be able to participate in home ownership. And then that could create domino effects. If we're not careful, it can create domino effects where then we need to expand the eligibility of who can apply for these grants. And that's why it's very tricky for the government to be involving itself in the free market with programs like these. I understand that HUD is increasing its limits, and I understand that housing costs, housing prices have gone up. But there is still inventory on the market. And at what point are we going to be artificially increasing the cost of that inventory because it's being further subsidized? I think that's something that we need to be very, very mindful of. Perhaps this isn't going to be too dramatic, but what about going forward? I guess one question I would like to proffer to the author of the bill is, how many existing first-time homeowners do we have waiting that are already approved for a grant but aren't able to get a home because there's nothing under $300,000 that they're able to purchase?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have that number at the top of my head, but if you give me a quick recess, I can definitely get it.
And I just proffer the question, Mr. Speaker, because that would basically give us a very clear understanding as to whether or not we do need to increase the subsidy. Otherwise, we're going to be creating a government influence on the price of housing that for those who are unable to avail of the grants, they'll be left with higher costs. And I raise these points, Mr. Speaker, because not because I don't support first-time home ownership. I think everybody in this room does. But we also need to be mindful of how the policies that we pass are impacting the cost variables of home ownership. Sometimes more subsidies, if subsidies are necessary because there is a lack of inventory, a serious lack of inventory, then there is validation to do it. But if the inventory exceeds, or even greatly exceeds, the demand, then artificially increasing the valuations with subsidies will just further exacerbate the problem. So I wanted to raise those points. I'm not quite sure if I may have amendments as a result of the information that I've shared, but I would like to yield to the other members of the body in the event that there's more perspective to be shared. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the main motion, any other senator wish to be heard? On the main motion, there'll probably be a motion to send this down to the voting file. Do you wish to make any amendments at this time, Senator Snickless? Because otherwise, we're going to have to bring this back up.
I would like the information, Mr. Speaker, as to the waiting list or the amount of individuals who are pending a grant and the number of them who are unable to get one because there is a lack of, because they need to be bumped up into the $300,000 threshold level for purchase.
Okay. On the main motion, nobody else wishes to speak. Oh, wait, Vice Speaker? Pardon?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a point of information. I'm waiting for if there is any current or they've already, if they already completed the waiting list, so I'm waiting for the current count. But just to be clear, that although we are raising the rate to $300,000 to mirror the HUD loan limit listing, this, in order to avail to this grant, you must have at least been denied by one bank. And so really it does not, well, I believe it does not drive out any middle to low income earners. Some families are only able to get a loan for $252,000. And so sometimes they're not able to afford the closing costs, so the $250,000 they can avail to the grant because they exceeded the closing cost by $2,000. So it kind of just provides some wiggle room to offer grants to assist those in closing costs or those that are interested in purchasing a home after they've been denied by the bank. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Lee on the main motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise in support of this bill, and I want to thank the sponsor for introducing it. At the public hearing, many of these questions that were asked prior were asked and answered by the president of the Guam Housing Corporation. We also did a quick search on realtors listings on the date of the public hearing, and the realtors listing found that there were 56 homes available between the $0 to $250,000 range. And by increasing the threshold from $250,000 to $300,000, 41 additional homes could be accessible to homeowners. And what President Chris Duenas, a former member of this body, had also mentioned were some of the challenges that some of the people who wanted to avail themselves of homeownership were encountering were that the existing properties and homes that were on the market that met that $250,000 threshold came without access to certain features in their home. So there wouldn't be a washer or dryer in the home. There wouldn't be access to a stove or certain kitchen amenities. And so that really prevented people from being able to move in right away. And so we just want to make sure that we're giving our working families an opportunity to avail themselves of that dream of homeownership. Again, at the public hearing, there was support for this bill by the Guam Association of Realtors, as well as the Guam Housing Corporation, and many of their board members who attended this public hearing. I think for me, in reading this bill, I really saw that this change in increasing the threshold by $50,000, it really might mean the difference on whether or not a family can close on their home. And so this bill would, initially it would be up to 4% of the value of the home, but we've capped that given the senator's amendment at $10,000. So a lot of times that $10,000 isn't a make or break it for many families. And I just want to reference some of the comments that were made at the public hearing. So at the public hearing, the Vice Speaker asked a lot of the same questions that were asked previously about whether or not the need was there to raise it to $300,000. And some of the responses were that we want to make sure that we're meeting these requirements so nobody is really being left behind at the point that we're seeing. We're not really seeing very many people that aren't able to qualify at $250 or wouldn't be able to qualify at $300. So we're not leaving anybody behind. And the potentiality is that we're going to leave out, or the question was that we'd leave out the neediest. And that's just not what they were seeing. There's a lot of potential for this program to assist even more families, and they're really just trying to chug forward to try to find a dedicated funding source to really bolster not only this program but other programs at Guam Housing. So I guess the question was a lot about supply and demand. And so as I've mentioned, there were 56 homes available at that $250,000 limit, but again, many of these didn't have a lot of the necessities that people need in order to move into the homes right away. And so we want to address the need for home ownership on this island, and I think that's what this bill does. And so I rise in support of this bill. Sujus Masi.
Thank you, Senator. Vice Speaker?
Just a point of information, Mr. Speaker. A home cannot be put on the market and be marketable for sale with a bank loan if it doesn't have an occupancy permit. And so I just wanted to clarify that these 49 homes, these 56 homes, They're not lacking necessities that would make them unable to be livable. They're livable. They have occupancy permits. They're available on the market, unless, of course, they're a home that is substandard. But then the banks won't lend for that. So I think we just need to be very clear what necessities are, so that we're just having a very transparent conversation about whether or not the price increase that will be affected by something like this is something that we really want to be doing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to preface my remarks with I would like to see that the information that has been previously requested and that will be provided, because I agree that that should be a concern if it does affect the market. When we had the public hearing on this bill, I asked specifically the president and the loan administrator, why are we moving if there are still houses available at $250,000 and you're able to process loans at the $250,000 level? They still have a long waiting list. I think they didn't have they weren't unable to keep moving the program along, but their explanation was absolutely, as the previous speaker said, based on the HUD housing levels. Now, I'm not a housing expert. I don't know what that will mean for the market, but it seems to me like that is where they got the amount previously. So it made sense to me at the time of the public hearing. If anyone can show how this will affect the market, then I'm very open to that. The president during the hearing also said, if this increase happened, the potentialities that we're going to leave people who are possibly the neediest out. And so that's just not what we're seeing right now. I can see what you're saying, the potentiality for it. As you know, we're also chugging forward to try to find a dedicated funding source. I guess that's a key word these days, but we're looking at a funding source that's going to really bolster this program and others. So I think that you're asking primarily is a supply and demand issue. Right now, it's equal, and so I don't think this increase would leave folks behind. I think if we found that maybe we'd have to revisit it. But right now, we think that we might be leaving people behind that are going to be just over that $250,000, that $250 to $275 because of the market. And it might mean the difference as to whether they can close or not close on a home. And then he says other things, and then anyways, he ends by saying that it's the right thing to do. And then the housing administrator says, increasing the total cost and the purchase price to $300,000. We follow the HUD's website, and we've followed HUD's loan limits for our loan limits. And so it was very clear during the public hearing that they saw a correlation between the two. Now, as I said, I'm not an expert, so I can't say anything further than that, but I just assumed if that was the minimal, and that's not and the HUD schedule that they provided, that was the standard amount, and it wasn't, they have other amounts here for high-cost areas, and it isn't anywhere close to that. So it just seemed to me to be that prices were going up, and so to get to the same value that we used to get for $250, we would now need to allow a little bit more. So I support the bill because of that intent, and but I do look forward to if there's any other information that could help us to make this decision, Mr. Speaker. And I would ask that maybe we recess until we get that, or we allow that to come back.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Nelson, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just received a message from Chris Duenas, and they are current with all their applications, meaning so they don't have a waiting list. And really, they have to have a home waiting for them in order to be approved. So once they give out the grant, they exhausted that application. So there's no waiting list for this specific grant. I'm sure there's a waiting list for something else that you're probably referring to.
Thank you. Senator Snickers, did you wish to?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to reassert my time, and I appreciate the author of the bill providing the information. So there is no waiting list, Mr. Speaker. The need is not there to increase the threshold, because the demand and the supply is balanced. If not, there's more supply, which means prices are going to come even lower, I think, Mr. Speaker, and that's something that we need to be mindful of. I just wanted to close with another perspective. If we do this and we increase the eligible home amount to $300,000, we need to be mindful of how this can also alter the marketplace from a village-to-village perspective. Because you go to some villages and you have homes that are not near $300,000, and you go to others that you have homes that are at or above that $300,000 level. The more we have homes closing at these higher valuations, especially when they're used for comparable purposes for appraisals, the more we can adversely impact the housing market, because then housing becomes more and more expensive all over the island. And once we start raising those housing prices, home ownership just becomes even more out of reach. And if the criteria for eligibility is having been denied a bank loan, then the more we raise the home prices, the more we're going to have people getting denied at the banks, and the more we're going to need to keep subsidizing them. And so that's why, from a public policy perspective, we need to make sure that we're not going to be creating more price inequilibrium, and that we're not going to be throwing off the market so that it's going to be creating a more expensive environment. And I just wanted to close with this, Mr. Speaker. With an example that compares it to something that I think a lot of us can relate to also, and that's rents here on Guam. When we try and match the federal standard for rents, it makes rent more expensive for everybody. So if we try and match the amount that's given out for GURA, or if we try and match the amount that's given out for cost of living allowance for military, it makes rents across the island more expensive because everyone wants to target those markets. I'm a landlord. I have a couple units. All of my tenants are local. My prices are all far below the GURA and the cost of living allowance amounts. But there are so many people in our community who can't afford to pay what that federal level is. If we just increase thresholds because HUD said we can, we're going to be creating the same kind of disparities in home ownership as we already have in home rental, where a federal uniform standard is just being applied that is making things more expensive for those who are ineligible for the standards in which you can get these kind of grants. So if you're not under GURA, if you don't have a cost of living allowance, rent is so much harder for you out there. And if you're not eligible for a first-time homeowner grant under this program, and prices go up because we've increased the thresholds and more people are buying at those higher levels because they're subsidized, those who are unable to avail of those subsidies are the ones who are going to hurt. And then what ends up happening is they get denied for the loan, and then they need to be subsidized. And so it almost creates a vicious cycle. So I see the intent. I think it's noble. I think that trying as much as possible to open doors for people is a policy that we should all pursue. But I just wanted to share the economic perspective of this, and how creating subsidies in an environment that doesn't need it can actually result in the creation of that need. And that's kind of where we are, seeing how we don't have a waiting list under the current $250,000 threshold. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? On the main motion, you may close, Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleagues for their support and also for their inputs. Mr. Speaker, basically, we need to look at, we need to take a glance at our market today. and the situation that's going on our island. There are federal policies that are put in place, such as the H-2B waivers. Now the OHA is being driven up. And so a lot of these do also impact the real estate market. And then we need to look at our working class families. We need to look at the cost of homes. Many times, we're starting to see now that homes are starting to increase in value, and sometimes even those that can afford a $250,000 home, they don't have the necessary credit or capital to get the closing costs. So if my bank cannot give me a loan for more than $250,000, but I need that money to close on this house, the First-Time Homeowners Assistance Program can help these families. It's an opportunity for our community to realize home ownership rather than them having to go and pay rent at an exuberant amount, whereas they can get a loan from the bank and actually own the real estate that they occupy. And so, my colleagues, I ask for your support in this bill. It will benefit a lot of families, and I think we need to also consider the federal policies that are in place that are impacting our real estate market today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to make a motion to move this bill 146-34 into the voting file.
Thank you. Before it's moved into the voting file, there was also an amendment that you had proffered to make it clear that the $10,000 was the max. Is there an objection to the $10,000 maximum? On that amendment? There being no objection, on the motion to send the bill with the amendment to the voting file, any objection? 147, Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to pass on file bill number 147 at this time.
Thank you. Senator Uggan, you're recognized on 204.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before moving for the motion, just for your information, there's a number of members in the body that have requested about the financial arrangement that would be formulated as a result of the passage of bill number 204, that's 34. And then also they had some follow-on questions that would be appropriate for the Department of Education to directly respond to. So prior to moving for this, I just would like to bring to your attention and to the body that I would like to request a committee in the whole discussion on bill number 204, that's 34, COR, as substituted by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication. So with that in mind, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to request the placement of bill number 204, that's 34 COR, as substituted by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication in the third reading file, voting file, for consideration by the body with discussion.
Is the superintendent back? As I understand it.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, yes.
I've been notified that, in fact, he is back.
Okay, there's been a motion to place 204-34 on the third reading file. Hearing no objection, and then your motion to have the committee of the whole?
That's correct, Mr. Speaker.
Are they ready? Are they here?
I know that the superintendent is on standby at the moment. We are communicating with GITA representatives.
We'll entertain another bill while you're getting everybody together on this one, all right? Senator Nelson, you're recognized on 206.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to move Bill number 206-34 into the third reading file and discuss the bill.
Any objection? Hearing none, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill number 206-34 is an act to add new subsection 5101 Bravo 12, 51102 Alpha 3 November, and 51102 Alpha 3 Oscar, all of Chapter 51, Title 17, Guam Code annotated, relative to the inclusion of the firefighter personnel of the Aircraft Rescue and Firefighting Unit as peace officers and the department heads of the Department of Youth Affairs and the Aircraft Rescue and Firefighting Unit as members of the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission. Mr. Speaker, upon becoming the Oversight Chair for Public Safety, this is one of the issues that were brought up early in the term of last year, that that the Department of Youth Affairs are still required to meet the post standards. However, they're not a voting member in the post commission. So essentially this bill allows them to be a voting member in the post commission, and then also to include the Aircraft Rescue and Firefighting Unit of the airport. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On Bill 206, main motion, any senator wish to be heard? Vice Speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I went to the public hearing on this, so I thought all my questions were answered, but I do have one more if I could, if the author would yield. I see in our peace officer categories statute, sections 3103 of the GAR, that firefighter personnel of the Aircraft Rescue and Firefighting Unit are included as Category 2 peace officers. However, when it comes to our Guam Fire Department firefighting units, only the firefighter personnel engaged in the enforcement of the Fire Prevention Code and those GFD employees whom the fire chief specifically designates are included as Category 2 peace officers. So it starts from when that provision was created, and I kind of want to know, what is the difference? Why are we including firefighters from the Aircraft Firefighting Unit as peace officers, but when it comes to GFD, we only included, and I remember when I was a member of the post, that it's only those who were engaged in the enforcement of the Fire Prevention Code, and those at the time, I think they said, who were doing investigations as peace officers. So I just wanted to know, so now we're kind of, and I have no objection to the bill because it's kind of putting into another place in statute what's already in the GAR, but I want to know what's the underlying reason for the difference in those firefighters being treated differently. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Can I just get a quick recess, Mr. Speaker?
Sure. We're in recess. Legislature's back in order.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. After speaking with the previous speaker, that is a separate section of the law, so right now we're just focusing on the post commission to address them as voting members of the post. For their category 2, why they are not considered peace officers, I cannot answer that question at this time, but we'll definitely look into it and see what we can do to rectify the current statute. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So we're moving forward on Section 3, but are we moving forward on Section 2? Section 2 is to make them peace officers, right? And Section 3 puts them in post. No one has any problems with the post, but do we want to still move forward with the peace officers?
No, Mr. Speaker, yes, we're going to put everything in this bill as written. We had a public hearing. The post commission supported the move. Interestingly, no one from the aircraft rescue and firefighting mission from the airport showed up, but we had other people come and speak on behalf of this.
Okay. Senator Espaldon, on the main motion. Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the author for yielding. I guess then my question would be, if they're peace officers, yeah, so I don't think sorry, I can't tell whether I got an answer to this already or not, but I don't see it in front of me. Does this affect then their pay? Will this bill affect their pay, or are they already being treated as peace officers as far as pay is being implemented, Mr. Speaker? And that's the last question I have on this bill. Thank you.
Okay. On the main motion, Senator Espaldon.
Just a point of information. There was, I believe, a question that was presented, and the question that was presented by the previous speaker, whether this has an effect on the pay. If under Section 2 that the aircraft rescue and firefighting unit are now deemed peace officers, does that affect their pay? And that has not been answered. I would like to have an answer on that too.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have the numbers for you, but I would like to make an amendment to perhaps dispel that concern. If we can remove section 2, and then we will just address the representative piece
On the post.
on the post.
Okay.
Okay.
So there's a motion to delete Section 2, and we'll correct it in the title, and we'll just move with placing the 2 departments on post.
Correct.
Is there any objection to that amendment? Okay, on the main motion as amended with just that last section, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Uggan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just in regards to Section 3, it says in the code that the composition of the commission shall be composed of 13 members, and then now we're identifying 2 additional. So if I can just request or move that legal counsel make the appropriate amendment in that particular section to reflect the total number, so that it's not 13 and then we have 15 lists enumerated there. So just that correction to allow legal counsel to make that adjustment in the language. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator Uggan. All right. So all we'll be addressing is the post statute with 2 amendments, 1 being the number and 2 being inclusion of these 2 departments. Is there any other senator wish to be heard on it? Senator Espaldon.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Actually, I just have a question, and perhaps to the author. I'm not as tuned in to this, but I guess this is implying that the Aircraft Rescue and Firefighting Unit does not fall under the jurisdiction of the fire chief. Is that a fair statement? Is that why we're having to do this? I see everybody nodding, so that's a yes.
Yes.
Okay, good enough. And I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the main motion, as amended with the limiting this bill to just post membership, the addition of 2, in the increase of the number from 13 to 15, and the change in the title that'll be done by legal counsel. You're welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleagues for their input. I'd like to make the motion to move this bill into the voting file.
Hearing no objection. Senator Argan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know we had a sidebar, and I did discuss it with a number of the senators in the room about conducting a committee in the whole on Bill number 204-34, and with the request that we convene that committee in the whole tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Just for your information, we did receive feedback from GITA representatives that because of the nature of the process, should there be any protests in the future, that they certainly want to ensure that they maintain neutrality as it applies to advocating for the government's position. So it would be the Superintendent of Education that would be coming before us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All right, so we'll do 204 tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. We're at 208. Senator Rodriguez. It's passed. Senator Ada, 213.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move to place Bill 213-34 LS as amended by the Committee on Environment, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform, and I'd like to discuss it.
Hearing no objection.
Mr. Speaker, what's being circulated right now is a 3-page handout which just provides aerial graphics of the area that we are talking about. We are talking about basically exchanging private property in the area of Chalampago Ordot in an area called Chalanfamha for a land exchange of private property, land exchange of private property that's being used as a public access in the Chalanfamha with government property in the municipality of Dedidome. Now, in bringing up this bill, let me point out right now to my colleagues a couple of sections there which is going to raise your hackles for sure. One is the land exchange is proposed, that's being proposed is a land exchange on an area for area basis. And in addition to that, in Section 4, the bill proposes that the requirement for land appraisals of land bills shall not apply to this act. So if you allow me to just go through, first of all, and orient everybody on the area that we're talking about. So in this aerial graphic on the first page, it shows basically where this area is. It's We're talking about lot 3287, and we're talking about a 2,000 square meter stretch of land that is being used right now as a public access, and that public access is actually encroaching on private property. And and you'll see to your right there is Agata Johnston. So just on the road that goes to the old ORDOT dump, there's a road that turns off to the right called Chalan Famha. This Chalan Famha, on the second page of the aerographic handout, gives a better view of this piece of property that's being used, piece of property that sits on private property in that lot 3287 that is currently being used as a public access to get to the residences. You see there to the northwest on your handout. And this road actually snakes around to the left. It's covered by treetops, and it actually continues out west to additional other lots out there. On the third page, you will see a sketch, and on there you will see an area that is marked off in blue. And right below that blue shaded area is an area that is colored in brown. That's the piece that's colored in brown is actually the that area, and then that's pointing northwest, and then an area to the southwest of that page is additional brown color. That's the area that, when added up, amounts to 2,000 square feet. And so this property, the bill proposes to then take this amount of property, give it over, deed it over to the government so that it can continue to be used as a public access, and exchange it for a piece of property up in the north in an area that had been set aside a long time ago for land exchanges, and for 2,000 square meters up there. Now, the significance of the blue shaded area there was actually part of the property that belongs to Mr. Francisco Santos, and about 25 years ago had given up basically a 25-foot easement to actually the original legal easement that was established consists of the blue shaded area and then the white unshaded area just above it. That was supposed to be a 50-foot easement. But what happened, and of that 50-foot easement, Mr. Santos had actually given a piece of that, the 25-foot part of it from his property. But what had happened was that the designation of that legal easement, the blue shaded area and the white area above it, was actually designated from a tabletop survey. Nobody actually went out there to take a look at it. And as it turns out, it's actually, I guess that's where the waterway, when it rains heavily, the river runs down through that. And so, of course, the people who need to get to the lots in the back will seek the path of least resistance. And so they started then basically moving their access up onto that brown area there, which was actually encroaching then into the Santos property. And it goes around, and then on the southwest corner there of that Exhibit C, the government also has been using that property within his lot to stage the equipment whenever, after a big rain, the river gets clogged up, and so the government needs to go in there with its equipment to clean out the runway and whatnot so that it can get the debris out and the water can flow freely. And so it has to stage its equipment on his private property. So this issue came up, and Mr. Santos approached the committee because they're in the final stages of trying to close out the probate on this property. And he's asking, then we need, if the public is going to continue using that access, then can the government then exchange that access, the 2,000 square meters of private property that is currently being used as a public access, with 2,000 square meters up in Dedido. Now, I'm sure my colleagues are wondering, but why are we going to forego the appraisal of the property up in Dedido, or for that matter, the property in Chalampago? Well, the problem is that in Dedido, that area has not yet been appraised and totally surveyed. And so in order to be able to go in there and make the survey, those preliminaries have to be done. The other justification that I will make here as to why we should go ahead and make this exchange on an area for area is that the Santos family has actually already given up twice the amount of property, the blue shaded area plus the brown shaded area will have given up twice the amount of property, about 4,000 square meters, and all he is asking in return is give him at least 2,000 square meters, enough to be able to put a couple of houses in. So that, Mr. Speaker, is my presentation on Bill 213, and I ask my colleagues to favorably consider this bill. This bill has been this property has been in probate for the longest time, and so they are getting this much closer now to closing this particular case. Now the bill has been amended further, because initially we thought, well, let's kill two birds with one stone and make this land exchange. And then also, since this original legal easement is no longer needed, let's give that back to the family that owns the adjacent lot. And land management came in and says, no, we need to maintain that easement, because that is where the water flows during heavy rains. And if that needs to be pursued, it should be pursued on its own merit. Thank you very much.
On the main motion, any senator wish to be heard? Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to clarify, I was at the public hearing, and at the public hearing and in the testimony submitted by Mr. Santos, the administrator of the estate of Francisco Santos, he had made it very clear that what they wanted was a value for value exchange and not an area for area exchange, which is what is in the bill. So I just wanted to find out from the sponsor, if he would yield, if there is anything from the Santos estate that says they are now in favor of this bill as written, or because that seems from the record it's going to look contrary to what they originally wanted. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Initially, when they came in, they wanted, of course, he's going to want as much as he can get, right? So he believes that his property is worth more than what he's going to get in return. But he was being pragmatic. He realizes that if we're going to go on the value for value, that means, having to appraise the property. Appraisers are not, lining up at the door for work. It's additional expenditures on his part. And so he's asking, you know, let's get this thing done and over with. And I guess to the question, yes, Mr. Santos is well aware that the bill has evolved to now an area for area exchange, and he is satisfied with that.
Thank you, Thank you. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like for our record to be very clear, and that so that we don't shortchange this family, especially in their eyes, if we're trying to do this to assist them, because their letter says, I'll read one paragraph and then another. So this one paragraph says, I am in agreement with the value to value for compensation, but I am now faced with time constraints and not able to have our property in order appraised by a licensed appraiser for comparison. But when we talked with him at the public hearing, he made it very clear he still wanted at that time a value for value. And then there's another part of the letter where he talks about he sent in photos of the garbage accumulated during the past 28 plus years that we inherited due to illegal dumping throughout the property, which we paid for collection, sorting, removal, and proper disposal. This is an ORDA. Then he says, see attached photos of our current property in ORDA after major cleanup and ongoing maintenance. See attached latest photos of the property in Dedido for comparison for land exchange. The property in Dedido lacks infrastructure, parentheses, access road, power, water, and phone lines. The property also consists of various garbage due to illegal dumping and abandoned vehicles, which needs immediate attention, along with financial burden to resolve these issues. Then it says it would be reasonable for me to accept 3 lots in Dedido for the taking of land in ORDOT. So again, I guess I would just ask, did we give him what he wanted? These 3 lots that he thought would be, meet his expectation as in light of the lack of infrastructure in the Dedido property. Is that what we're giving him in this bill? The area for area, it doesn't look like that to me, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, well, Mr. Speaker, like I said at the outset, Mr. Santos had, wanted to, really would have, if he had preferred that the government compensate him for the expenses he incurred to clear out all the junk that the public had been dumping on his property. Wanted to go back to 25 years, but then, Mr. Santos is a pragmatic individual and realizes that, look, we need to close this issue, and right now he'll settle for the area for area. I agree, I probably should have gotten something in writing, but I know I'm not confused about what he said he would be amenable to.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I guess I would just ask that before we vote on the bill, if we could get something in writing, that would make the record clear for future generations who are looking at what we are doing today. Otherwise, yeah, I have no objection to compensating this property owner with a land exchange if the committee finds that to be appropriate. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Speaker, I think that's reasonable. It's early enough in the week. We can set this aside, and we'll contact the Santos family and have them provide something in writing that he is fully satisfied with the bill as written.
All right. So we will set this aside. Did anybody else want to be heard on the main motion? Senator Lee, Senator Espaldón, I saw you rise. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in light of what the author of this bill had mentioned, if we're going to be setting this bill aside, I'd also like to just ask for a map of the tract in question. So on page 2, line 20, a suitable and equal portion of tract 11405, government land in the municipality of Dedido. It's my understanding from speaking with the author of the amendment that it's in the Isengsong area, so if we could also have a map of that property, that would be helpful. Sujosmasi.
Thank you. On the main motion, anybody else wish to have the sponsor get further information since we're setting this aside? Okay, the bill's been set aside. Senator Addy, you still have the floor with 214 now.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't realize we were going to move so fast, and my staff still has my folder which has some handouts that's going to be very important, so I guess I'll have to set that aside for now.
All right, Madam Vice Speaker, Bill 218.
I don't have my folder either, Mr. Chair, but thank you. I will proceed with this. I'd like to move that Bill number 218-34 as substituted by the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation be, sorry, 218? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Be placed on the third reading.
Hearing no objection, you're recognized.
Bill 218, Mr. Speaker, would require the Department of Revenue and Taxation, Motor Vehicle Division, Driver's License, ID card branch to submit information to the Guam Veterans Affairs Office to assist the Veterans Affairs Office on Guam with filling the local registry. Thank you. As you know, the Veterans Affairs Office on Guam has really been challenged in trying to adequately report the accurate number of veterans that are living on Guam, and it's pretty much common belief by everyone for years. You can find it in legislative intent in the creation of the registry itself, that the hope is that by adequately reporting the number of veterans, that we are going to be able to make a better case in all aspects, in grant applications, in just direct government to government negotiations for services and other ways that veterans can benefit from their service here on Guam, Mr. Speaker, without well, we all know the challenges that they're facing in having to go to different places to receive different services, or having to answer to a region that's being operated out of another area instead of Guam. The Department of Revenue and Taxation has no objection to this bill, Mr. Speaker, and our discussions is very able and willing to work in this regard, and has assured us that they are currently working with the Guam Election Commission in a similar process where they are, accepting information there at the Motor Vehicles Division and transmitting that confidential information to the Election Commission as required by statute. So they have no doubt in their capabilities to do this and to keep it confidential, Mr. Speaker. I guess I'm going to ask my colleagues for their support on this bill. Thank you.
On the main motion, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Uggan, then Senator Nicholas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the sponsor of the legislation who is ensuring that the transmission of these forms are made through a secure network. And now that the government of Guam has the Office of Information Technology, I'd like to ensure that anything that is prescribed as a secure network that certainly has the eyes of that particular entity of the government of Guam. So, Mr. Speaker, on page 2, line 26, if I can proffer the insertion after the word prescribed by, insert the Office of Technology and. So it would read, as prescribed by the Office of Technology and the Office of Veterans Affairs. So in that particular case, Mr. Speaker, the similar insertion of that phrase also would be appropriate on page 3, line 18, because the language on both sections read more or less the same. So it would be appropriate to ensure the proper security and that our government entity that has been identified specifically to be responsible for technology would be part of this entire process. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to propose that amendment.
Thank you. Vice Speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With all due respect, I would raise an objection to that amendment simply because we did have discussions with the Office of Technology, and we do expect them to work very closely with the Guam Veterans Affairs Office, and they have actually to date been a great help, and the Veterans Affairs Office is actually equipped and rolling in filling the Veterans Registry with the information that they've had in physical files for years and years. So, but when it comes to ensuring the confidentiality, I would like to leave it at the discretion of the Veterans Affairs Office, because they are the ones who are recognized even throughout the nation as having the capability to deal with that. They are the ones we are setting up in this law to be the one to set up the rules and regs. And I just think and Department of Revenue and Taxation is also dealing with their own, prescriptions and how, so the two of those entities are going to have to work together. And I think no one will be able to move without the authority of the other or the cooperation of the other, and to ensure that everyone is meeting those very prescriptive conditions. So I would like to assure my colleagues that I think that the Veterans Affairs Office we've already mandated by law that they are going to handle all this information, unless we have doubts right now whether they are able to maintain the confidentiality. I don't think they're going to move forward with any technology. It's very clear that they will be advised by the Office of Technology, but they must in the end make the ultimate, I think, decision as to whether this protects confidentiality as they are required to do. That's my suggestion, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? I understand now, not the main motion. On the amendment by Senator Uggan, there's been an objection by the sponsor. On the amendment by Senator Uggan, I'm sorry. On the amendment by Senator Uggan to include OTEC, Senator Uggan?
Can I close?
Well, no, it's not closing. I'm trying to figure out whether or not anybody else has any comments on your amendment. The amendment by Senator Uggan is to add OTEC into the discussion. I see Senator Nelson and then Senator Snogestein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have a question to the proffer of the amendment. If we are to add the Office of Technology, what is their primary role as part of this transmission of forms may be made by electric means over a secured network? Are they setting up the network and putting in the parameters? What is their primary goal, or their role, their primary role?
Both are, in discussion. I don't
Oh,
think
I
either
see.
one heard your.
I'll ask again if the proffer, the amendment would yield. The what is the primary role of Office of Technology if they were to be included into the transmission of forms may be made by electronic means over a secured network?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Senator, for that particular question. I think that when you take a look at the mandate that is affiliated with the Office of Information Technology, it mandates that collectively they provide the upgrade in the systems as well as in transmission of information for the entire government of Guam. So as we look at this, what would be their involvement is ensuring security. We have had breaches of personal information, and just as recent as last week, Mr. Speaker, I found out about a possible impact on my personal information. So with all of this out there, I would recommend against allowing the Guam Office of Veterans Affairs, the administrator, to be able to dictate what kind of system would protect the veterans' information when already we have tasked the Office of Information Technology to provide that safeguard and that security. So I'm looking out for the interests of not only future veterans, but I'm also looking out for the interests of our veterans right now in terms of ensuring that their personal information remain confidential and it's not at any cost breached. So that would be their direct involvement, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So just to clarify, they are in charge of providing a secured network. So they must set up the implementation and the information assurance policies to ensure that these documents are transmitted from Department of Revenue Tax to the Veteran Affairs Office. Okay, so if I may ask another question, not for the proffer of the amendment, but perhaps for the sponsor of the bill. What is the role of Office of Veteran Affairs in this transmission of forms may be made by electronic means over a secured network? What will the role of the Office of Veteran Affairs play?
Excuse me.
The reason why
Senators, there's a question being proffered to the sponsor.
Yes, to the primary sponsor of the bill.
The primary sponsor
Yes.
or the sponsor of the amendment?
Yes. No, the primary sponsor of the bill, because...
The primary sponsor of the bill, Senator?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. By statute, I'm trying to see how long ago this was adopted by the 32nd Guam Legislature that established this Guam Veterans Registry and mandated that the Guam Veterans Affairs Office, that they will be responsible for everything about this registry, for establishing it, maintaining it, ensuring that, you know, it's confidential, which is why I just thought, because they're the ones who are facing liability for breach of that, and they're the ones who are really going to have to swear as to the security of it, that they are going to, you know, of course, I don't think they would even pursue an electronic network unless it was, I mean, the bill requires that it be secured. So they're going to have to receive assurances from the Office of Technology that this is assured and this is assured. This is a secured way to do it, this is a secured way to do it, and if they had any options, who makes the decision? I am submitting that it should be just one entity, at least on the receiving end, so, and because they are the ones also that are going to have to maintain that. I don't expect that they can do this without the Office of Technology so, and I think Office of Technology is mandated to assist in all of our technology procedures for the government of Guam, and already mandated to ensure that when we say secured network, it is indeed a secured network. So I just think unless we're going to remove this ability from the Veterans Affairs Office, that we've already charged them with this responsibility, and so that's their role in it, Mr. Speaker. Does that answer the question?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So it appears that the Office of Veteran Affairs they're mandated to ensure the protection of the registry, and it seems that the way the bill is written, the transmission of forms may be made by electronic means over a secured network as prescribed by the Office of Veteran Affairs. I think it is only prudent to support the amendment to include Office of Technology, because it is the Office of Technology that will set the parameters of the secured network. It can be, it can be additional firewalls or whatever have you, but they would play an important role with the mandate of the Office of Veteran Affairs to transmit the documents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator San Augustine and then Senator Castro.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the amendment introduced by Senator Uggan. Number one, when we want to talk about revenue and tax, they take their instructions from the IRS because they get inspected annually. For the Office of Veterans Affairs, they don't have the technology backing. They would have to turn to the Office of Technology or whatever agency that's supporting them for technology. So I would support that amendment.
Senator Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too rise in support of the proposed amendment. As one of the previous speakers alluded, based on the spirit and the intent of the law and the establishment Office of Technology, they have that responsibility, but it's not explicit. And so it wouldn't hurt if the amendment was incorporated in the existing initiative. I can speak firsthand. It's practically, it's almost impossible for the Chief Technology Officer, given the current HR resources and infrastructure, for them to go over every contract. But what I can tell you is that the incumbent CTO, if it's explicitly outlined in statute, takes it upon himself to include that in his regular reports, at least to the governor and some of the public hearings. So if it's incorporated in the statute, I would suspect that the CTO will make it a specific line item in his report. I mean, it's possible that the contracts that go through could be approved just by a cursory review of the contract that comes across. But unless there's a specific provision for the CTO's signature or for his explicit review of a technical provision of that contract, it could pass unnoticed. So I would recommend we include it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard on the Uggan amendment? On the Uggan amendment? There being none, there's been an objection. Do you wish to close? Senator Uggan, do you wish to close on your amendment?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just very quickly, I understand the nature of the objection by the mover or the sponsor of the legislation, but we need to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we add, at whatever cost, any safeguard necessary to protect the personal and confidential information of our veterans as it applies to this legislation. And that's what I'm proffering, is to ensure that what she said, that right now the Office of Information Technology is contributing, working with other government of Guam agencies to be able to provide similar service, and it would be proper to mandate that they also be involved in this so that we can safeguard the personal information of our veterans. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
There's been an objection to the Uggan amendment. All those in favor of the Uggan amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes. On the main motion, Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've addressed a measure similar to this in a prior session, and this has to do with ensuring that the information that's being collected out there that may help to bolster our numbers of registered veterans actually makes it into the Office of Veterans Affairs. In our prior sessions, discussions on previous measures that did pass this body, we did discuss the need to ensure that the party of interest, the veteran, was actually consenting to this information being transmitted. And in previous sessions, we spoke at length about the need for this, about whether or not there's applicable laws that relate to this. And long story short, Mr. Speaker, in those previous sessions of those previous pieces of legislation that had a similar intent, we did amend those bills to include language that would require the party of interest to document their consent prior to the information being transmitted. And so I'd like to make an amendment, Mr. Speaker, in the same spirit of those previous actions with respect to this bill, which also seeks to do the same. On page 2, line 21, after the word shall, I'd like to insert a comma and put, with documented consent of the party of interest, comma. Page 2, line 21, after the word shall, insert a comma, and the words, with documented consent of the party of interest, comma. It could be a checkbox on the form or what have you.
Thank you. This Nicholas amendment is to include with documented consent after the word shall. Any senator wish to be heard on this Nicholas amendment? Any senator wish to be heard on this Nicholas amendment? Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no objection to this amendment. I think it might not be necessary because in order for a veteran to go and apply for a free license plate or a free driver's license, they, after this bill is passed, are implicitly consenting to all parts of the law that are going, that, you know, they will be subject to going forward. And so they are going to be put on notice at that time in their application. But I have no objection to including it as a precaution for the benefit of my colleagues who are in doubt of the capabilities of the Department of Revenue and Taxation. Thank you.
Any other senator wish to be heard on this Nicholas amendment? On this Nicholas amendment, any other senators wish to be heard? If not, is there an objection to this Nicholas amendment? On the main motion, any other amendments?
Thank you. Once again, if I may, on page 3, similar language after the word shall in line 13 on page 3. There's 2 sections of this bill that cause information to be transmitted. We've already included that language in the first section, but this is the second instance that it occurs. Page 3, line 13, after the word shall, insert similar language.
Thank you very much. Is there any objection to the amendment being proffered by Senator Nicholas on page 3? If not, do you, on the main motion, did you wish to be heard?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to comment in reference to the primary author of the bill on our comment that when a veteran comes up with their form, the DD-2 form to revenue and tax, and I support the amendment that Senator Nicholas brought up. They don't consent to anything. All they did was they did the shortcut. Instead of going down to ask them to get the form, they went up to revenue and tax and they turned in their DD-214. That's all they did. They didn't consent to anything else. And by having the consent there in place, it protects the privacy of their data.
Thank you. On the main motion? On the main motion, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the amendments intact, I stand in support of this bill, and I want to thank the author of this bill for moving it forward. We recently had budget discussions where we had the Department of Military Affairs as well as the Office of Veterans Affairs come before us, and they were able to give us an update on what each of those 2 agencies of the government of Guam are able to do and some of their challenges. And the Department of Military Affairs was able to identify how much money they have been given out of the general fund and how much money in turn is So that's kind of like the local match, and then $49 million in federal funding that has been able to come in because of our small $900,000 contribution. And so it's my hope that with bills like this, and the more that we bring veterans issues up for discussion, that the more veterans will hopefully register, and we'll be able to get those numbers up and hopefully bring in additional funding and additional support, much needed support for our veterans and for our families here on Guam. So again, I rise in support of this bill. I ask my colleagues for their support as well, and I thank you all. Sujos Masi.
Thank you, Senator Lee. On the main motion, any other senator wish to be heard? On the main motion, if not, Vice Speaker, you're welcome to close. Vice Speaker?
I would just like to thank my colleagues for their assistance in amendments to the bill, and ask for their continued support in our efforts. I would like to at this time commend the Veterans Affairs Office, who I think has actually made quite a bit of progress this year in updating this registry, and I know they also have an online registry which they have created in conjunction with how it's being done nationwide. And so, but this is a registry that is separate and apart from those that are created by the United States Veterans Affairs Office, separate and apart from any other federal office, and that I believe will be very useful for us. And I think that was the intent of the original statute, creating this registry and authorizing the Veterans Affairs Office. So I just want to wish them the best as they go forward with this, and again, thank the Office of Technology for their support in getting some of the backdated files inputted, and hopefully we're moving along. I was hoping that they could complete this within the fiscal year, Mr. Speaker, so I'm still optimistic, and I really hope that that is done. Thank you very much.
On the motion to send the bill to the voting file, any objection? Senator Rodriguez, you're recognized on Bill 208.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move to place Bill 208-34 as amended by the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation on the third reading.
Any objection? Hearing none, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Bill 208 is a bill to establish a legal framework in which the innovative concept of ride-sharing can coexist with our current taxi cab operations. The model being established by Bill 208 may alleviate some of our public transportation problems and is a dynamic step forward in allowing our private sector the opportunity to not only help transport our people, but also to give an innovative economic incentive by creating jobs. Ride-sharing has existed in other countries for some time now, and it's time for Guam to join this revolution in transportation. We are seeing the market in other jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker, evolve and grow, continuing to add additional innovations from package delivery to document delivery. I also believe that this legislation strikes a balance between our established taxi service and the ride-sharing business, allowing them to coexist. Mr. Speaker, as you may know, our colleagues may know, that this type of service is already being offered on Guam. You have at least one company that has emerged. They're called Stro Guam. I understand there's others that are emerging. The problem we have here is that we have no legal framework, no statutory provisions in law that would regulate and allow for this to actually happen. And so how they have been able to license them and make this move forward, I know that Reverend Tax has been trying very hard to accommodate them. However, this bill would set the parameters to ensure that the safety of our people are protected, but it also ensures the safety of those who are drivers of these ride-sharing businesses to be protected as well. And so I ask my colleagues to please support this measure. It was, I believe, in our December session that I tried to move this forward. There were some issues that were brought up. I want to thank the chairman of the committee, who has now since made the revisions needed, and now we're ready to submit this, this bill for the body's consideration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the main motion, are there any senators that wish to be heard? On the main motion, are there any senators who wish to be heard? No? Vice Speaker.
I want to commend the author of this bill. I think the amended version clarified a lot of the questions that were raised at the public hearing. And I just want to ask just maybe one more, just to be sure, if this bill changes licensing for taxicab and creates a license for a transportation network company, a TNC, does it conflict with the current taxicab statute under Chapter 11 of Title 16? Or do you find this to be consistent? And I guess if council's here, yeah. In particular, may I just add, will a taxicab company need to get a regular taxicab license and then a TTNC license if they want to operate through online requests?
Do you yield?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Because I caught your second question, yes, they would need to get that. But your first question again, Madam Vice Speaker? Yes, we've worked with legal counsel to address perhaps the inconsistencies that may have been on the initial bill. And so we believe, the committee believes that this version is consistent and now ready to be considered by the body.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill. It has a lot of potential to benefit people in Guam, especially with the state of our current public transportation system is still lacking. And we haven't received a formal testimony from the Department of Revenue and Tax, which I was hoping that they would submit something just to give us some kind of ease, or to put us at ease that they are able to regulate, do the enforcement and the regulation of this new industry. But it sounds like they are currently under the Department of Revenue and Taxation. They've been receiving licenses, or they're being monitored, right, through regular business license applications, but there's really no additional testimony from Revenue Tax that would give us any additional information in that regards. But otherwise, I hope that it can be an industry that the users and the participants feel is being regulated fairly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Senator Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too rise in support of Bill 208. I want to commend the author for introducing a piece that has the intent, at least in my opinion, to lower the barrier to entry. And whenever you do that and you stimulate market competition, it's a good thing. I think some of us have taken a cab and have noticed the fares, I think, from Tumon to Agate, or even from Barragata to the distant areas, as being relatively high. But I think with this new model, some of us are familiar with the model, either in the state of Hawaii or other states. It's actually very competitive if you have one or more entrants who are willing to participate in the market at a reduced cost. So thank you.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also wanted to rise and commend the author for addressing many of the issues that were brought up during the public hearing on this bill, Bill 208. Of note, I think some of the things that I was most concerned about was there have been several instances with ride-sharing companies in the States and in other parts of the world where there have been people who operate these ride-sharing vehicles, and they may have had previous criminal records, and so, you know, for the safety of those who would use these ride-sharing vehicles, we wanted to make sure that they were protected. So I just wanted to note that in this bill, it does explicitly state that people convicted of certain crimes within the last 7 years, including felony, misdemeanor for DUI, or other driving-related offenses, any misdemeanor, violent offense, or sexual assault who is on the registry would be not able to operate these vehicles. And then also with regard to access for individuals with disabilities, there's also a waiver of the fee. So all drivers are required to have the business license, which is $50. But if the driver uses an ADA compliant or a wheelchair accessible vehicle, that $50 fee is waived. And so that was one of my concerns coming into the public hearing. And I do have a question for the author, if he'll yield. Another issue that I wanted to bring up was just the safety of all the people who might be using this ride-sharing service. So we know that safety is a really important issue, especially when the driver is transporting babies or young children. And so if a rider doesn't have a car seat, one of the questions was, would the drivers be able to provide a car seat for infants and small children so that they would be following our laws?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe the question was, will the driver be able to provide the car seat? I believe that the driver should know, I'm hoping, right, should know the law that requires that children or infants be in a car seat, and would follow that. I'm sorry, I didn't, if that's the answer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Anything further, Senator Lee? Senator Nelson?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's been an unsaid common practice with perhaps some taxi cab industries bringing in passengers and taking them to underground establishments that promote sex trafficking and human trafficking. So I just wanted to ask the sponsor of the bill a question in regards to the impact of this bill. Will this assist in the accountability for where taxi cabs take passengers coming in and out of the airports as far as locale is concerned, location?
Do you yield, Senator?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to our the retiring speaker. I believe so, Mr. Speaker, because the way these things work, if my daughter is to get into one of these ride sharing from the point of where she's picked up to where her destination is, there's a way to track that. And so I think this really brings that that accountability and just knowing where these drives take place.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the sponsor of the bill for offering this forward. It also will contribute to a positive aspect in the accountabilities of what is going on with our taxi companies' businesses. So I support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Any other senator? Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? If not, Senator Rodriguez, you're welcome to close.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleagues for their participation in the discussions of this piece of measure. Also want to thank co-sponsor Senator San Augustine. As I said in my opening, Mr. Speaker, this is really an innovative step forward in the way we handle our public transport system. It's also, I've known quite a few people, friends who are at the university and want to make a few dollars to help them, have expressed their desire to be part of this. Some of them are actually driving for at least one of them now that is doing this. And so I'm hoping as well, Mr. Speaker, that for those in our community with some disabilities, that this could also be kind of an interim solution to some of the problems we're having. I've talked to some in the community who are familiar with other jurisdictions who have Uber drivers, I believe, that have outfitted their vehicles to accommodate those with persons with disabilities. And I'm hoping that that can be a trend here as well, because that's how we can kind of address the problems we're seeing in our public transport system. But also finally, Mr. Speaker, it's a way for us, for our government. We know that we have a program within public health that helps people go to find work, gives them money to be able to get from point A to point B for employment purposes. And with a transport system that we have now that is unreliable, this is one way that they'll be able to get to work and hopefully sustain that employment in the future. So again, ask my colleagues for their support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the motion to send the bill to the voting file, there be any objection? Hearing none. Senator Ada.
Mr. Speaker, we were moving so fast there for a little bit that I overlooked bill number 214, and we went straight to bill 218. So if I may be allowed to take bill 214 and then proceed on down to the next bill. But then I would also ask for your indulgence. When we were discussing bill 213, there were two requests for documentation. One was some documentation from Mr. Santos substantiating that they are receptive to the bill's proposal of an area for area, and I have passed that out to the members in an email.
Has everybody received that?
And it reads,
go ahead.
We stopped by your office to drop off the revised as-built map and also to inform you and Senator Tom Ada that we've decided to settle with the area-to-area basis for land exchange. So I would ask, may I go ahead and finish off Bill 213?
Please.
A request was also made by one of the members for a map. Now, I don't know whether you want a registered map or what, but I do have a handout here of the area that has been set aside years ago by the governor of Guam for land exchanges, which basically shows where these lots are. And so that's being passed out now. Now, exactly which lot of these numerous lots here, that's going to be left to land management and the Santos family to agree on. So with that, I believe that I have satisfied the request. One, documentation substantiating agreement with the area for area, and some kind of map showing where these lots are. So you see on the east side of the sheet that I've passed out is the Sengsong Road. And I guess the next reference there is the Familia store. And off to the left there, all those lots is basically where, somewhere in there, a lot of measuring 2,000 square meters will be provided. So I don't know if that satisfies my colleague's request for a map.
Thank you.
So with
so
that,
you may close.
So with that, I would ask my colleagues to help the Santos family bring this issue to a close finally, so that they can complete their probate case, and also at the same time be compensated with a area for area exchange of property. Thank you.
On the motion to send Bill 213 to the voting file, is there an objection? Hearing none. On 214.
214. Mr. Speaker, 214, actually what it does is it is to allow for the creation of sibling subdivisions. And so the way this bill was structured is that currently in Title 21 GCA Section 62104, it ends with 62104B, which talks about the parental subdivision. And what the parental subdivision does is it allows a parent to pass to his descendants, to his children, basically subdivide the tract of land that he wants to give to his children. Now, in the subdivision law, normally it's required that certain improvements be put in. For example, required improvements shall be permanent sidewalks. They've got to put in streets, alleys, and sidewalks. You've got to make sure that there's provisions for stormwater drainage, domestic water, and sanitary sewage disposal, and all that. And so in a commercial subdivision, when a developer comes in, he has to put in all these improvements in this subdivision that is being planned. And it has to be accomplished within a reasonable amount of time, within a year or two before, otherwise, in order to be in compliance with the subdivision law. With the parental subdivision, it allows these improvements, the accomplishment of these improvements, to be deferred. And they basically just say, yes, we will put in sewage and water and streets and all that, access, easements, but then they are allowed to defer that for a period of time, a reasonable period of time. Now, that's allowed for in the parental subdivision. But then you have the latest instance that has come to the attention of the committee is the sibling subdivision. So then the parent gave all his land to the one child, and early on, and then more siblings came, and so he wants now to give, to basically distribute some of this land to his siblings. And so, but the law does not allow for this tract of land to be subdivided and for the required improvements to be deferred. So basically what Bill 214 does is it actually took a mirror copy of 62104B that deals with the parental subdivision and mirrored it as paragraph C, a new paragraph C. And the changes that are made that's different from the parental subdivision is on line 2. It talks about divides his said land among his siblings. And on line 7, the alienation clause that once this land has been distributed, that the new owner cannot sell it for a period of 5 years. That same 5 years, or I believe in the 5 years, that same alienation clause is also in the parental subdivision. And so that's really what Bill 214 is about. It's just simply to expand this deferral of improvements on subdivided land within the families.
Thank you, Senator. On the main motion, any senator wish to be heard on the main motion on sibling subdivisions? Vice Speaker, and then Senator Uggan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in support of the bill, and I'd like to commend the sponsor. I think if the intent of this bill is to further extend the original intent of parental subdivisions, and that is for people of limited land to be able to give this land to their children without meeting all the requirements of regular subdivision, then that is commendable. However, I would like to point out that the bill, as corrected by the prime sponsor and amended by the committee, did not include all the recommendations by the Department of Land Management, which I thought were very useful, and I agree with the Department of Land Management in this instance, because they are looking at their experience with the parental subdivision and giving us recommendations. So in their letter of December 15 to the committee, Land Management suggested that well, let me just read this. I think it's important for the public to hear this. It says, unfortunately, we've seen what appears to be an exploitation of Section 62104, where land developers engaged in small-scale single-family home development have used this law as a means to subdivide lands into the smallest lot size possible, without having to install appropriate utilities, especially public sewer connections. So if in their experience they are seeing an exploitation of that parental subdivision, and because people are able to sell it after 5 years, then these new owners we now have subdivisions where they are not even related and without sewer and the other utilities that we normally require of regular subdivisions. So I would like to, consistent with the recommendations of the Department of Land Management, make a motion to amend the bill on on page 2, line 7, instead of 5 years to 7 years. The Department of Land Management, in making this proposal, suggested that while this alienation period should not burden the vast majority of persons who exercise this process, it would discourage those who use this exemption as a path to skirt the existing subdivision law in ways it was not intended. And I think that's a reasonable, the original bill had 25 years, which was quite long, and actually had no objection to that. But I can see how, some people might actually require transfer of their property in less than 25 years. So I think 7 years is reasonable, and I'm grateful that the Department of Land Management has looked at the parental subdivisions and give us this number, and they think that this number, from changing from 5 to 7, will actually make a difference. So I would propose that amendments to my colleague, Mr. Speaker.
Point of information, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the point of information is that the Department of Land Management actually recommended to 10 years, not 7.
All right, I'm looking at a December 15 letter. Maybe is there something else? Mr. Speaker, my apologies. I don't see that. The letter I'm looking at from Department of Land Management is December 15, but if we could take a 1-minute recess, that is a January 2018 letter that I would like to review.
We'll take a short recess.
I changed it to
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I note that in the more recent testimony of Department of Land Management, January 10, thank you to my colleague, they are actually, they propose a change from 25 to 10 years instead of 7 years. I guess I will stick with my, well, I'll make a motion then to change that to 10 years, Mr. Speaker, consistent with the recommendation of the Department of Land Management. We are making a big exemption in allowing them to subdivide without any other of the, following any of the other requirements, and this is just to ensure that that we follow that intent.
So the amendment being proffered by the Vice Speaker is to change the period from 5 to 10 to comply with the most recent letter from the Department of Land Management. On that motion, on that amendment, any senator wish to be heard? On that amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Any objection? Hearing none. Is there an objection? Hearing none.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. And I would just like to make another amendment to the bill on page 3 of the bill, where on line 14, where it says, what did I say? Page 2 of the bill, on line 14, where it says shall be required either to secure a bond for the said improvement. Again, the Department of Land Management recommended that this bond, that we specify the amount of the bond, and so their recommendation was of no less than 112% of the value of improvements of utilities. And this is because they're supposed to promise that they're going to put in the I think it's the roads and the whatever improvements are required, utilities. So it's probably their experience that this is not being done after a reasonable period. So just to ensure that, if we could specify the amount of the bond, that way we can ensure that the promises are being kept by those who are availing themselves of this special exemption. So I'm adding 112%, of no less than 112% of the value of improvements of utilities.
Okay, the Vice Speaker has proffered an amendment that the bond be no less than 112% of the value of the improvements. Any senator wish to be heard on the amendment proffered by the Vice Speaker? Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the amendment that's being made, and because it was upon the request of land management, or at least their advice. However, that being said, if we are going to go down this road, they also have other recommendations for this whole section. And if I may read their testimony regarding this issue, they're asking us to change lines 12 through 17, where shall be required to either secure a bond for said improvements, and here's the amendment that was proffered, of no less than 112% of the value of improvements of utilities. And then that was the amendment that's before us. And then it goes on, the testimony of land management, there has to be another amendment, that because right now the way it reads, or to sign an affidavit stating to the effect that said improvement shall be accomplished within a reasonable period, which is in the legislation right now before us. However, what then now the land management is saying is to add also another section there that says not to exceed 3 years, wherein if said improvements have not been completed, the Director of Land Management, under advisement of the Guam Chief Planner and Guam Chief Surveyor, may exercise the option to null and void the previously approved parental or sibling subdivision survey map. And so I believe that if the amendment is going to be made consistent with the testimony and the advice of the Department of Land Management, that it should be perhaps made in whole as opposed to piecemeal. Because if this amendment as being proffered, which is to be the bond, to secure a bond of no less than 112% of the value of improvements of the utilities, if that is passed without passing the second one, second suggestion, then it would be incomplete, because then it would, as in this legislation before us right now, it would read, or to sign an affidavit stating to effect that said improvement shall be accomplished within a reasonable period. So if we don't make that additional recommendation by the Department of Land Management, what we have here now would be a piece of legislation that says, okay, but you need to secure a bond for 112% of the improvements necessary, or you can just sign an affidavit that you're going to do it within a reasonable period of time. And I would imagine that most people will sign that affidavit within a reasonable, and say, yeah, I'll get it done within a reasonable period of time, with no other conditions or consequences to the, to the persons who will be deeding out this property. So I just kind of caution us as we move on this particular amendment that there may be another amendment that needs to be made on the second part of this one paragraph. And again, if we pass one without the other, then we perhaps have something weaker than something that's demanding in terms of securing a bond, but really has no consequences if the alternative, which is just signing an affidavit, is the chosen path of the subdivision. So that gives it, bottom line, I don't anticipate anybody signing or going out for a bond for 112% of the improvement value, as opposed to just signing an affidavit saying, yeah, they're going to do it within a reasonable amount of time. So I have to at least put that out there, that if we are following the recommendations of the Department of Land Management, that perhaps we should take a look at the recommendations as a whole when it pertains to this paragraph. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator. On the Vice Speaker's amendment of 112% of the value of the improvement, any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Ada.
Mr. Speaker, The intention here when Bill 214 was being drafted was to basically mirror the parental subdivision. And admittedly, when land management came in to testify, they brought up this issue about the parental subdivision being exploited. But at this point, we wanted to make that one step forward to at least make the sibling subdivision option available, and then of course the next step would be to take a look and reform the subdivision law, which would have taken a much longer, which would have been certainly a lot longer process. So for that reason, Bill 214 was introduced so that we can provide that parity between with the parental subdivision. But I will admit that I think my colleague has from Tamuning has raised a valid point, and I guess we're going to have to review the entire parental subdivision law and look into this matter of how developers are exploiting the parental subdivision provisions, and maybe tighten that up as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and send the bill back to committee.
Thank you very much, Senator. There being no objection to sending the bill back to committee, you also have a Bill 222.
Mr. Speaker, I move to place Bill 222-34 COR as amended by the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform, and I'd like to discuss it.
Hearing no objection, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Bill 222-34 is an act to authorize the sale of a 394 square meter irregular remnant portion of the old PD Agana Road fronting lot 85-2-R1 in the municipality of PD. What's being passed around right now is an aerial photograph to get you oriented as to just exactly where we are talking about. So the lot in question is the lot that the MDA, the Micronesian Divers Association building, is located. And right behind that is that leaning rock. So as you can see in that colored aerial graphic that's been provided to you, outlined in red is actually the public easement that the MDA owner is asking to buy. How this building was able to expand and encroach as much as it has into the easement, I don't know. It's there. Now they are asking to buy that easement, which no longer actually serves the public, because where that easement is originally was where the PD Agana Road was to be established. But as you can see, that road, Route 1, was actually realigned closer north closer to the ocean. So the bill then seeks to authorize the governor to go ahead and sell that 394 square meters. And then once that authorization is given, of course, then the preliminaries that need to be performed to be able to execute the sale will then take place. Appraisals will have to be done. In Department of Land Management's testimony, they are calling for 3 appraisals. And of course, Section 3 calls for, as required by 2 GCA, Section 2107B, relative to appraisals of land, shall apply to this act. The proceeds of the sale will be deposited into the Chamorro Land Trust Survey and Infrastructure Fund, and that's really the extent of Bill 222.
Thank you very much, Senator. On Bill 222, on the main motion, is there any senator that wishes to be heard? Senator Snickles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in full support of Bill 222-34, and to further express that I believe that this bill represents a singular problem of a very, very larger issue, and that is that throughout our island, we actually have a problem of these very small lots being held still under the title of the government that are too small even to put a house on, and they're actually impractical for any real public use. And so I just wanted to put on the record that I think it is also necessary for us to consider developing wholesale legislation to allow for these odd-sized lots to be placed into private hands so that we are no longer allowing the disorganization of the government with respect to its holdings to get in the way of these private enterprises being able to properly extract the fair value of their assets. If government land is sitting in the middle of a contiguous piece of property and it's unusable for any practical purposes, then it's actually holding back the ability of the community to get the highest and best use of all these properties. So I'd like to commend the author for introducing this bill, and I would like to also express a desire to work with the author for perhaps a more encompassing wholesale approach to all of these odd-sized lots that are of little to no use and are actually obstructing the ability for the island to continue progressing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to speak on the main motion? On the main, Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm reading through my notes on this file for the public hearing, and I'm noting that the Department of Land Management testified at the hearing again that they disagreed with the conclusion in the bill and the findings that this lot was landlocked. He said this land is adjacent to Marine Drive, I believe, Route 1. But if I'm looking at the correct version of the bill as amended by the committee, I don't think that's been changed. It still shows that as a finding of the legislature, that the land is landlocked. The second concern I'm raising is that the Department of Land Management had discussed that there had been an encroachment by the person who we are now offering to buy this property for many years, and that they had suggested that the land trust should be compensated for the encroachment. And I asked them about a formula. They didn't have one at the time, but I would ask if the committee chairperson could help us to include that. I think that we're taking property out of the trust and selling it now to an adjacent landowner or an encroaching landowner, but the government has not been compensated for the encroachment over the years. And the Department of Land Management also seemed to think that that would be fair. And so that's my concern, Mr. Speaker. I also think I had asked at the public hearing for the adjacent landowners and whether they would be offered to purchase this property also, but they said, I don't know, can the sponsor please just confirm whether this would not be available to any other adjacent landowners? It would only be available to the current landowner that is actually encroaching on this property?
So the sale of the easement is just for the owner of this particular lot. Now, any of the adjacent owners, if they want to buy that, they have to buy that, then I think that they should initiate that request, but we shouldn't, we shouldn't be volunteering it. But at least the committee didn't think that it should now say, okay, since we're selling it to this lot owner, let's go ahead and make it available, because they may have different set of circumstances that they may not want to avail themselves of that opportunity at this time.
Is that satisfactory?
Yes, regarding the purchase, and in regards to the compensation for the encroachment over the years, Mr. Speaker, is with the sponsor yield, if there were any, was he able to find any formulas that we could perhaps proffer at this time?
No, and Department of Land Management did indicate in their testimony that without any formal process to determine the loss compensation, they just don't really know. So where do you begin? How do you begin? They can go back and pinpoint when this encroachment took place, but no, they never came back with a formula as to, okay, they owe us in back rent so many thousands of dollars. So at least as the sponsor of the bill and the committee decided, all right, let's just cut our losses now, sell that property, and get the proceeds and put it into the land trust.
And Vice Speaker, is that satisfactory? Do you have any further questions?
I think I have one final question, Mr. Speaker, and that would be, who is bearing the cost of the surveying of the property? I don't see in the bill. If the sponsor would yield, yeah.
It doesn't, but it does say in the bill that it does give a citation relative to appraisals of land that 2 GCA 2107B shall apply. I can go into 2107B and did you have something, Senator? But usually what happens is the government will select an appraiser, the landowner selects an appraiser, and if the two are different, they take an average of the two. To tell you the truth, it doesn't say here. Go ahead.
Yes.
Sorry, point of information, Mr. Speaker. I had the same question, and so I asked legal counsel, and per subsection B, 2 appraisals must be done from 2 separate appraisers, one of which must be paid for by the transferee. So in this instance, it would be MDA. Oh, both of them should be paid by the transferee. So in this instance, that would be MDA. And one of the appraisals must not be more than 12 months old.
Thank you to my colleagues, Mr. Speaker, but my question is regarding registration, not the appraisals, because according to Department of Land Management, this easement is an unregistered government of Guam property, and as you know, all property before it can be transferred must be registered. And so they're suggesting that the purchaser should be required to produce a land registration survey map and register the entire remnant of the old Piriaganya Road as shown on survey map LM checked number with the Superior Court of Guam. As you know, this is additional cost that will be incurred. All land registration expenses shall be borne by the purchaser, although the department shall be available to assist with the land registration process. The Department of Land Management is asking, if I may just point that out again, to produce register the entire remnant shown on their map that they attached. And then they say, following successful completion of the land registration, the old Piriaganya Road should be subdivided in a new survey map to be completed by the purchaser. The owners of 85 85-2-R1 and Lot 85-2-1 should then be authorized to purchase those portions immediately adjacent to their respective lots. So under their recommendation, this will affect, I'm thinking, there's a different owner for one of those lots, but it would treat both of them in one fell swoop fairly and take care of the remnants that exist in one lot that would be required to be registered and subdivided. So I would like to make an amendment that that language be added. It's on page 2 of the February 9, 2018 letter by the Director of Land Management, and that we put that entire paragraph with the help of legal counsel into the bill as a requirement, a new section of the bill that the purchaser be required to produce a land registration survey map and so on, and subdivide. That would be my motion, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Adams.
Mr. Speaker, I would have to object to that until we get a full understanding of what all it's going to take to do the land registration. We're talking about surveying, and when you go to survey, you don't just go and survey that piece. We have to go from, the idea that now this landowner who's wanting to buy the easement in front of his building is now going to have to bear the cost of registration, is going to have to bear the cost of surveying the points on, I think it's going to place a great burden. And I'm coming from that perspective of let's get that land sold so that then now that landowner, at least that piece of property, can start earning taxes on it. And then the owner of that building can, do what it is that he needs to do. But, land management comes down here with a lot of recommendations, but they're not the only game in town. So right now we're following the law. The bill says, that land appraisals will apply according to the public law, and that he identifies that this is an unregistered piece of property. Well, whatever it takes, I think land management should do that. But why are we now going to unload on the private property owner? So I would object to that amendment.
There's been an objection. And any other senator wish to be heard on the Tirlahi amendment?
Mr. Speaker, if the mover can repeat the amendment, please, or provide a copy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to add a new section to the bill that would read, subject to amendment by legal counsel, that would add the language, the purchaser shall be required to produce a land registration survey map and register the entire remnant of the old PD Agana Road as shown on survey map LM checked number 039FY85 with the Superior Court of Guam. All land registration expenses shall be borne by the purchaser, although the department shall be available to assist with the land registration process. Following successful completion of the land registration, the old PD Agana Road should be subdivided in a new survey map to be completed by the purchaser. The owners of Lot 85-2-R1 and Lot 85-2-1 should then be authorized to purchase those portions immediately adjacent to their respective lots.
Is that satisfactory, Senator Nicholas, or can you provide him with it's a letter that was provided by Land Management that's in the committee report. Senator Nelson and then Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have a question for the proffer of the amendment. In any other land transaction that is done, isn't this what the purchaser, isn't this the process that the purchaser has to undergo? Or is this the process that the purchaser has to undergo in any ordinary purchasing of land?
Thank you for the question. I believe that in order to officially receive your remnant, it has to be officially described. And the only way to do that for unregistered property is to go to court and have the property registered and then officially subdivided. So that we will not have any questions in the future like we had, or this landowner had, as to whether they were the owner of this remnant or not. And I believe it's only fair, Mr. Speaker, if I may, because they have been encroaching on government land. The government is helping them out by allowing them to buy this property instead of suing them for encroachment and requiring them to remove their building or incur any other costs like that. And so I think it's really only fair that they be required to incur whatever additional costs the Department of Land Management or the government of Guam would have to incur in order to complete this transaction.
Is that satisfactory?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, thank you. If the sponsor of the bill would yield, I do have a question. I mean, it's probably coming out of left field, but in square meters perhaps, or miles, how much property does the government own now? And the reason why I asked this question, Mr.
Where?
Huh?
Where on that, or throughout the island?
No, just in general. How much property does the government own? Because I'm just a little bit confused on why we would want to sell government land and not lease it out to them and charge them a prorated cost for encroaching in the first place.
I don't believe the sponsor has that information. Okay. I believe we're still on the Vice Speaker's amendment, which is contained in a letter that has been distributed now to everybody. Is everybody clear as to what the Vice Speaker's amendment is? Is there Senator Espaldon, then Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, relative to this amendment, I know that we're including basic language from Department of Land Management in their testimony. And the very last sentence is that shall be included in this amendment to the bill. The owners of lot 85-2-R1 and lot 85-2-1 should then be authorized to purchase those portions immediately adjacent to the respective lots. I guess the question is MDA the owner of both lots? Because, and I have to ask that question because the way the bill, the legislation that is before us right now, in essence is saying, well, this should be sold to MDA because they're the ones whose building is on this property. So I'm not really sure who the owners of the two lots that are mentioned here are, and I'm just wondering if the proffer of the amendment does. Otherwise, maybe we should eliminate that last sentence.
I don't know the owners, Mr. Speaker, but and it's not available from what I can see on the map. However, the map does show the bull cart trail that we're talking about, and without including the bull cart trail, I mean, it's a remnant along Marine Drive of a bull cart trail, and so to take care of only one small portion of that remnant and not the other would really just further make that bull cart trail unusable to the government or anyone. I don't know the owner. I don't know the adjacent owner.
Well, and the reason why then I would have to at least move to strike that last sentence is because the legislation is very specific in terms of which remnant of property it's trying to sell and to whom the government will sell it to. If we include the last one, then it's not really relevant to the bill before us. So at this point, I would like to make an amendment to the amendment to eliminate the last sentence, beginning with the owners of the lot should then be authorized to purchase those portions immediately adjacent to the respective lots. This bill right now addresses only the portion of the lot in front of MDA, and that portion is to be sold to MDA. And without knowledge of who are the owners of those two lots that are specified, then I think that, again, we can't go forward without determining who those owners are. And this bill specifically addresses the owners of the lot where the remnant piece is to be sold.
Would we need to know who the owners of the lots are, or if it's the owners of MDA?
And that's what we don't know. And that's why I'm saying if we just strike that last sentence, then actually everything else is relevant to this bill as it is written right now. But until we find out who the owners of the two lots are, one of them might be MDA and one of them might be somebody else. But this bill doesn't require that. This bill before us right now, in essence, sells it to MDA.
Vice Speaker, or do you have an answer?
No, Mr. Speaker, I would like to move that we set this bill aside. I think we need to understand what all is involved in having to take on the burden of registering. Because then also, as they had recommended here, if now MDA has to bear the burden of registering this property, now should the cost of that undertaking be borne by the adjacent lot owners? I think I would like to set this bill aside so that we can get a better understanding of this particular paragraph or the amendment that's being made.
Vice Speaker, there's a motion to set this aside. Do you have anything further that you'd like to have him investigate or provide information so that when we bring it back up, we'll be able to move forward?
Well, I would just like to state on the motion to set aside, I have no objection, and I have no objection to the prior motion. I think that would expedite this one particular bill. The other property we can deal with in a separate bill, or however else land management thinks they can deal with that other property. But I just, yes, I think if anyone has any questions regarding land registration, I'm also open to answer those, or I'm sure council can answer whatever questions they have. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the motion to set aside, there being no objection, we'll stand in recess until 9 tomorrow morning.